this morning. It is turning out to be a very nice day. Hopefully we get the kind of warmth that the weather people had promised. It looks like it might continue for a little while, so enjoy it while you can. Who knows when the tides, or in this case the winter weather, will turn once more. If you would go ahead and open your Bibles, Matthew chapter 18. And if you do not already have one, bulletins are available in the back. They have an outline in them. We're on the A side, and the title is the most important and pertinent question to this concept, or this context. Who is the greatest? Now, I considered asking a few of the young people. I didn't want to leave anybody out, and we have quite a few young people now, so I decided, and also, you generally don't want to ask a question that you're not sure what the answer is going to be given. But if I were to ask the children, and maybe you guys do that later on, who is the greatest? And I would just leave it at that, especially the younger children who aren't ready with, the God answer all the time, play the God card constantly. Who is the greatest? They would likely suggest that mom, or dad, or policeman, or a firefighter, or superheroes are the greatest. If you were to ask a child what they wanted to be when they grow up, children are incredibly idealistic. They think of the greatest things in a much different way than we do. And that's very telling. Children, when they're young, don't want to be doctors because doctors supposedly make lots of money. None of them want to be CEOs. None of them necessarily want to be rich just to be rich. They want to be firefighters. They want to be policemen. They want to be moms and dads. They want to be superheroes. And you ask them why. Why do they want to be those things? And why do they think those people are the greatest? And children conclude, usually because they're daddy or they're mommy. And to them that means they serve that function. They fulfill that role. They take care of me. They serve other people. That's what makes them great. They take care of you. They sacrifice that you might be safe and cared for because they serve. And when Jesus is asked this question here in Matthew chapter 18, look at verse 1. He says, at that time, the disciples came to Jesus saying, who is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Do you suppose they had the childlike attitude that we just discussed? They, if we conclude from other passages where the disciples ask similar questions, they are coming from a position of wanting simply to be on top, wanting to be validated, wanting to feel good about themselves, wanting affirmation from the master. And while children can sometimes desire that, they don't always seek it out. In verse 2, Jesus called a little child to him, which gives us a little bit about it. Call a child to him implies that the child was capable of locomotion. So you're not talking about an infant here. You're talking about a young child. Someone capable of walking. And what I found that as they gain the ability to walk, they also generally gain the ability to talk, which is a double-edged sword, let me tell you. Because children speak their minds. Children don't generally pull back. And that's not such a terrible thing. Sometimes embarrassing, but not necessarily a terrible thing. In verse 3 he says, and Jesus says to them, assuredly I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Wow! That is legitimately strong. If you cannot manifest some form of characteristic that I'm implying here, something about this child that I am looking for amongst yourselves, you won't enter the kingdom of heaven. Like, that is harsh in theory. And so Jesus uses this object lesson. He calls this little child to him, and he sets this child in the middle. And he doesn't talk to the child explicitly, but having the child there serves the purpose. What is it about children that Jesus is pointing to? There's a few things. One thing that I have learned is that children love to help, seemingly until they are useful. And then suddenly they don't want to help anymore. I I can't tell you how often the children wanted to do the dishes until they learned what it was to do the dishes and were finally capable of doing the dishes, and then nobody wants to do the dishes. Children invariably want to help. They want to serve. They want to be an assistance. They want to be a part of things. In Matthew 11, if you remember back to our study there concerning John the Baptist, and when his disciples come to Jesus and ask him a few questions, remember what Jesus says concerning John. Assuredly, I say to you, among those born of women there has not risen one greater than John the Baptist. Why would Jesus say that? Or what kind of characteristics would you imply or infer from John's character, from John's person, the decisions that John made? And then he goes on, but he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. And so we have a similar discussion, a similar argument. In the realm of greatest in the world, you have John the Baptist and little children in the same conversation. Isn't that a weird discussion to have? There are positive characteristics to children, and it's important that we recognize these characteristics. And if you have had a little child, you've been around a little child, you've ever seen a small child, you practically have witnessed some of them. Young children are incredibly optimistic. Again, idealistic. They are imaginative. They are teachable. They're innocent. They are pure. At what point do children decide that becoming a CEO so that they can be rich is what they really want to do with their life? That's taught. That's something they've learned from others. That's something that they've discovered from the world. When a child wants to be something, they want to be some form of service. They want to be teachers and doctors. They want to be superheroes who save the day. They want to be those people because it embodies who they are as young people, as idealistic individuals, as innocent. Children are devoid of ambition. They have no pride or haughtiness. Sometimes they speak what they feel is true, even if it's not. But they are honest. The common denominator we see here in verse 4. Therefore, whoever, here's the word, humbles. I'll tell you, this world does not like the term humbles. We've talked about this quite a bit lately. Jesus loves the word humble. He not only embodies it, but he demands it from his disciples. He requires it from his people. And he says to them, and he points to this little child, and he says, if you can't be like this little child, if you can't humble yourself to submit to the authorities that are over you, if you can't learn how to belong to someone else, if you can't be converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. He says, therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus points to two individuals, John the Baptist in Matthew 11, and this random child here in Matthew 18. And this isn't his first experience with children. We saw just a few chapters ago that Jesus seemed, the disciples wanted him to leave, or he wanted the children to go. The disciples didn't want the children to come around because in their minds Jesus was for adults. That's ridiculous. We have great songs that are put in their place in Bible class and not sung elsewhere. And I appreciate that some of the song leaders here lead those songs fairly frequently. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong. They are weak, but he is strong. You know, little ones you can replace with anyone. Chris belongs to him. He's weak, but God is strong. Jesus is mighty. We need to learn how to be childlike in the right ways. Sure, the Bible deals with childlikeness in all the wrong ways. And the Hebrews writer would talk about some of the people he was dealing with as little children, incapable of appreciating and understanding the meat of the Bible, and had to go back to the milk. And we're not moving beyond that and learning how to be teachers and develop their relationship with God. They were babies, which is not the same concept as here. They describe children. Jesus describes the Jews as children who are complaining that I played music and you wouldn't dance, that you wouldn't do whatever I wanted you to do. Children can be like that sometimes. So there are negative aspects of childhood that we should move beyond. I'm not saying that we should all go back to sucking our thumbs, but that we advance in all the right ways and we remain innocent and pure in all those right ways as well. Whoever humbles himself as this little child. Remember, in Mark chapter 9 and verse 35, right before the parallel passage in Mark of this situation happening, where Jesus points to this child and calls for them to be humble as children. And there in Mark chapter 9 and verse 35, Jesus says, if anyone desires to be first, let him be last of all and servant of all. I don't know how much further we could go with this. I'm sure quite a bit further. I'm sure we could keep talking about humility and still not be beating a dead horse. The Bible is consumed with humility. Recognizes it, encourages it, demands it even. But he's going to go on here. Notice as well, if we keep going in verse 5, not only is it a challenge for us to become childlike in our innocence and in our lack of ambition, hopefully, that we'd be idealistic and innocent, but we'd also be humble. Look at verse 5. He says, whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. And I thought to myself, what does that mean? Right? We talked about the practice of journaling, of writing notes when you're studying something. And I will tell you, and I keep going back to it, that it's incredibly important. It's incredibly helpful to me. I write little notes to myself. And I may very well have forgotten to consider this. In fact, I did, and it wasn't until Friday, I think, I was going back over my notes after my sermon had been relatively well developed, that I was going back over my notes, and I wrote in the margin of my notes, because my notes are crazy. I mean, they're ridiculous, but they're just notes. That's the point. I write down my thoughts and what comes to me. And in the margin there, next to this concept, next to what he's saying there, whoever receives one of these receives me, I said, what does that mean? Because it's one thing for us to go, okay. And that's usually what we do with the Bible. That's usually how we handle things that are complicated or difficult or take some time thinking about. We just say, okay, we accept on face value what's being said. And what is Jesus talking about? When he says, one who receives me, what does that look like? And I'll tell you, I saw it. I saw it this summer. I see it from time to time. And sometimes I embody it, thankfully. Sometimes. But I saw it this summer. There was a young lady at camp. And her and her brothers had recently lost their father. And it was heart-wrenching. And she spent a lot of time crying. And she didn't want to get out of bed one day. And she didn't want to move or do anything. And one of the young ladies, one of the counselors there, she took her special blanket. It's just a blanket. But she took her special blanket and she wrapped it around this little girl and she sat with her on her bed for, I don't know, an hour? Maybe longer? And just hugged her. And just hugged her. Receives one of these little ones. That's what he's talking about. Taking care of, emotionally, physically, taking care of not just children in this case, because he would draw this application much larger. But I want you to start there. What was it? Did it cost her any money? Did it require anything spectacular from her? Empathy and compassion, which is in short supply in this world. Why can Christians be so significantly different than the world? Because we've been called to do something that should come naturally to a human race, but doesn't. Because Jesus calls for us to do something for children who oftentimes just get neglected and left behind. And she sat with her and she talked with her. And it was enough for that little girl to come out. She still had the blanket, that special blanket. But she came out to campfire that night. She was able to function. I'm 34 and I don't know what it would be like to lose my father. I mean, the thought of it is already racking me emotionally. And this girl was like 8 years old. What would that be like? I don't know. But you know what I would want? I would want a special blanket, and I would want to sit in my bed with someone to cuddle me for a while. Just hug me. That's what I would want. And so that's what this young lady did. Sometimes it's the simple things. Sometimes it's almost always the simple things that matter in life. It's very rarely the large, grandiose movements and the big things that we do. Usually it's the tiny things that matter the most, and that's what Jesus is pushing towards. When my child tells me that they love me, it's worth the world. Whoever receives one of these little ones receives me. Whoever cares for one of these is caring for me. And isn't that the very premise of Jesus when he's talking to his disciples in Matthew 25? And they can't grasp this. They can't wrap their head around it seems, at least for a time, and maybe they get it later, and obviously they do, because look at what the first century church does when things go wrong and their lives are in a mess and they're struggling to survive. They bind together. There at the beginning of the book of Acts. But in Matthew 25, what does Jesus say? And the king will answer and say to them, assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did it for one of the least of these my brethren, you did it for me. So it's not just children, but it's for one another. That we love the brethren, we take care of one another, that we seek the best for one another. And I love verse 39 there. Because what do the people who are doing these things say? Why would you say, I did it for you? You weren't there. I've never seen you, Jesus, to be able to do these kindness to you. And they are so flabbergasted that Jesus has to explain to them. These people who are already doing this kindness and this generosity and being compassionate and finding opportunities to love. He has to explain how they were actually doing it for him. Because they weren't ulteriorly motivated to do it for him. They would have if he were there, absolutely. But they didn't need that in order to do it. They didn't need to sit back and reassure themselves that this was the right thing to do and that Jesus was going to reward them. Because it was the right thing to do, so they did. Because it was compassionate, because it was kind, because it was human of them. And that is, friends, something that this world has lost. And a place where Christians have the opportunity to shine, to be those people, to love, to care. And in such, we can be the greatest in the kingdom. We can be the greatest people in this world. But the thing about being the greatest in the world, you never know that that's what you're trying to do. No one would ever know that that's what you're attempting to accomplish. Because you don't have to do it in any kind of grandiose, major way. Because it's always been the little ways that matter. He moves on from here to dealing with these little ones in relation to sin. And this is an important concept for us as Christians, as parents, as leaders, sometimes in the community. And usually when I think things should go without being said, I make sure that they get said, because things that people say should go without being said usually just really need to be said. And probably twice. So look here in verse 6, he says, but whoever causes one of these little ones. So that first word is really important. But I'm going to change gears, Jesus says. We're going to go in a different direction, and it's not going to be a pleasant one. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world because of offenses. For offenses must come, but woe to that man by whom the offenses come. Jesus says, in the same way, or technically the opposite way, of the value of an individual who will do what is necessary and what is good for these little people, the same, in the opposite direction, is the case for anyone who causes these little ones to struggle, who puts stumbling blocks in their way, who leads them down the wrong path, causing one of these little ones to sin. What does that mean? Right? There it is again. I wrote back to my notes and I went, well, I haven't dealt with that yet. So I really need to. Because if I'm asking that question, it's probable that other people are too. So what does it mean to cause a little one to sin? Well, in Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 6, you're probably fairly familiar with. It says, to train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. It's important to remember that that's a general truth. In general, this is the case. Does it always work? No. And I have seen people beaten up over it, or beating themselves up over it, as if they could have done more, even though they were great parents, and they did everything they could, potentially, to lead a child into righteousness. Sometimes the generalities don't work out. But are we setting the little ones on the right path or the wrong path? Are we preparing them for a life in this world or a life beyond this world? Because there is coming a day, if your child reaches the age of accountability, exceeds that age, and becomes a person in this world, they will give an accounting for the things that they have accomplished in this world. Or have you prepared them for that? Have you prepared them to live lives in keeping with His will, that will find them in the judgment both sure and steadfast, because they have trusted in God? And not that you can make that decision for them, but have you put them on the right path? Because we can lead our children to make some really, really bad decisions with all what we consider good intentions. When we prioritize things of this world over the spiritual, we are making poor decisions, and we are preparing our children for the wrong future. Is there a place for education and thinking about your future in this world? Sure. But should it take precedent over their spiritual life and their relationship with God? Certainly not. In Matthew chapter 23 and verse 15, Jesus, speaking to those scribes and Pharisees, He calls them hypocrites. Woe to them! For you travel land and sea to win one proselyte. And when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. These people were after fame, to be fair. They were after popularity. They were after people to follow them. And so they would go out into the world and they would find people who would follow them, but they would lead them down the wrong paths. They would teach them the wrong truths, and they would corrupt them, rather than allowing the innocent and the idealism of the youth to indwell in us and to encourage us. Sometimes children come up and they want to be involved, and they don't necessarily know how, and sometimes we stifle it. Sometimes because we don't know what to do, because we are not idealistic anymore, because we don't think that the world is our oyster, spiritually speaking, that we could do anything and we could try anything. Sometimes we say things like, we've tried that before. Try it again. You have a young person who wants to do something. If it's a good thing to do, put them to work. Get them doing it. And help them do it. We should spend more time with the youth, that we might have them rub off on us. That their innocence and their purity and their idealism, their optimism, their imagination, and their teachableness, I don't care if that's not a word, might rub off on us. Children are an incredible asset. And we are fortunate, we are blessed, we are lucky to have so many in our congregation. So let's help them find their way. Let's put them on the right track and help them stay on that path. That we would be the first half of this equation and not the second. Because as great as it is to enter the kingdom of heaven, look at the consequence of leading one of these little ones astray. He says, you'd be better off hanging a millstone around your neck and being thrown into the ocean, into the sea, where there is no hope. There is only drowning and destitution. In Romans chapter 14, I encourage you to read it, the whole of Romans 14, and then also the whole Bible, but Romans 14 is an incredible section concerning causing a brother to stumble, and Paul argues that if meat were to cause my brother to stumble, I wouldn't eat it. If there was a situation, even though he knows that an idol is nothing, and the meats offered to idols is just a bunch of knuckleheads burning food that is unnecessarily burnt to some entity that doesn't exist. There's nothing unsacred or unrighteous about the food that they're burning or they're cooking. It's just discounted in the marketplace. But if I have a brother or sister who struggles with that thought, with those situations, and I'm with them, I'm not eating it. I'm not buying it. I'm not dealing with that. Because my brother's soul is more important than some discounted meat. Right? Last week we talked about taxes. Why did Jesus encourage people to pay their taxes even though they're children of the King? Because it's not worth the trouble. There are much more important things to deal with. And when it comes to my brethren, we might work to develop an understanding of what is good and what is righteous and what is holy. But until that time comes, I'm not pushing it. I'm not going to advocate for shoving my liberties down my brother's throat, even though they're my liberties. Paul says, I'll give them up. I will gladly yield them for the time so that I can develop the important things first. I will not cause a brother to stumble. Offending one of these little ones is bad. Offending one of our brothers in an unrighteous way, bad. And then in verse 8, we'll finish here. Verse 8 and 9, he says, if your hand or foot causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter into life lame or maimed rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into the everlasting fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter into life with 1 eye rather than having 2 eyes to be cast into hellfire. When we're handling sin, we need to be very cautious and very concerned about the well-being of the people around us, the youth as well as the people who are potentially weak in the time. But we also must be mindful of ourselves. We need to mitigate and eliminate sin. Oftentimes, instead of the word mitigate or eliminate, we use manage. We need to manage sin. We don't need to manage sin, friends. We need to get rid of it. We need to toss it out on its ear. When the Christians in Ephesus found out, or they became Christians, and they found out that the use of magics was wrong and unscriptural, unbiblical, unholy, did they sell their books of magic so that they could pay for things that needed to be done? They burnt them openly. That is the hostility they had towards this sin. They hated the sin. And they wanted to get rid of it. How much do you like your hand or your eye? How much do you appreciate it? We say things like, it's like my right hand. Well, what if in this wild world, it doesn't work this way, but what if you could cut your hand off and it would help you deal with sin? It would help eliminate sin from your life. Would you do it? How much do you like your hand or your eye? Because we need to hate sin even more than we like our hand, than we like the ability to see. We have to hate sin even more than we love life. And we've got to put it in its place. We've got to get rid of it from our lives. In part because who is watching? Who's watching? These little children. Because of our weaker brother. Why should we get rid of sin? First and foremost for ourselves, because we want to enter the kingdom of heaven, but also because of our example. And we say manage sin. We say, oh, well, I'll keep it from others, but I'll deal with it in my own life, things that I don't need to deal with. That seems ridiculously dumb. That seems wildly inconsistent with what the Bible teaches. So let's not manage sin. Let's mitigate it. That is to say, eliminate it everywhere possible. Can you get rid of it entirely? No, because you live in this world. Because you work with people that aren't Christians. Because you live in a world with family that aren't always Christians. But we have to be able to hate sin in such a way that we would remove it from our lives in every way possible. That we might be greatest in the kingdom. And you might say, well, I want to be greatest in the kingdom, and I hope you want to be greatest in the kingdom. I hope you want to be more greater than even you are now if you're in the kingdom. But if you want to be greatest in the kingdom, the first thing and the important thing is to get into the kingdom. You got to be in the kingdom to be the greatest in the kingdom. The Lord added to the church daily those who were being saved there at the end of Acts chapter 2. In Acts chapter 2 and verse 38, we find out that those who had heard the gospel, had believed, confessed, They were told to repent of their sins and be baptized in the name of Jesus for the remission of those sins. And then they could, as Jesus talks to the church in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10, and then they could live their life in Christ. They could live faithfully until death, and then they would receive that crown of life. If you desire that crown of life today, if you desire a place in heaven, it's available to you. It's yours for the taking, but you must receive it according to God's will. You must obey His commands. You must love Him and seek Him. You want to be greatest in the kingdom? Look to the children, the young people of your life. They can help you. They can show you the way in a way that few adults can. They can teach you how to be idealistic, how to be optimistic, how to be innocent. And I pray that you wouldn't take on some of the negative qualities of those children always. We have opportunity to grow, to work together with one another for the future of the body of Christ. And I pray, however we can help you do that, I pray that you would let us know if we can, as together we stand and sing.